Alright, this is part 3. Before I even go into part 3, I just want to mention at the end of part 2, we were talking about the seals. That was the main thing. One thing I forgot to mention about the seals is you got to also understand, read the first, like the first rider, the second rider, third rider, fourth rider. Read them very closely. If you don't see wrath in that, you're not reading it right. You're not understanding. If you don't see wrath in diseases, death, global inflation, food that's so expensive you can't afford it, civil unrest all over the planet, war all over the planet, it's sheer and utter chaos. If you don't see that, you're not understanding wrath. I know there are some people in never existed when I was young, but now people are saying, oh, wrath starts over here. No. Actually, wrath has already started. The end times prophecies which lead up to the tribulation period is wrath. Talking about earthquakes in diverse places, roaring of the seas, famines, diseases. I mean, look at AIDS and all these other stuff. It's so normal to us, you've forgotten this stuff is actually how bad it's gotten in the past 50 years. Rise and scoffing, men's hearts failing them fear. All of these things are end times prophecies. So when you get to the seals, read them carefully, especially those first 4. I didn't even mention that the first rider to me is religiosity. Some people say he's the Antichrist, but I'm not going to spend much time here. I've missed that opportunity. I'm just going to keep on going. But the thing I didn't also mention is that last seal is a moment of silence. I don't pretend to know why. But I'll just point out, for me, it seems like it's sort of like the silence before the storm. Because now things are going to start getting pretty bad. In other words, for the seals, now we're going into the trumpets, things are going to start getting pretty bad. Everything else is bad anyway, but this is just getting worse. So anyway, moving into part 3. One of the first things you mentioned, that arm is mentioned, is the incense. Pay attention to that, because the incense is basically goes up before God. It's the prayers of the saints. Think about it. Think about it. In your own personal life. How many times have you prayed to God because you're being oppressed, or because you're hurt, because somebody did something bad to you, whatever? What about the people who suffered more than you? Think of the Christians of old, how they suffered at the hands of the Catholics, for example. Think of the Jews, how they suffered because of the hands of the enemy. Think of Babylon and Baal. Think of all the oppression that Jews and Christians have faced over the years. Imagine all these prayers, being oppressed, being murdered. God, please save us. And Christians like, God, why aren't you answering? I'm asking you for help, and then they die, whatever the case may be. Think about it. All at once, all these prayers are going up before God. If you're not following what I'm saying, you're not seeing it the way it should be seen. If I show you everything that was negative that was done to your mother, for example, in 1 minute, you're probably going to walk away from that furious. Furious. So imagine all of this stuff going up before God at one time. You have a moment of silence with the last seal. Now you got the incense going up before God. It's about to start getting worse, because now the 7 trumpets are coming out. But first was the incense. So when you go to the trumpets, you'll see it's bad. But remember, the incense goes before God's first. The prayers of the saints go before God first. I'm imagining, I don't have a lack of a better word, but I kind of like this word for whatever reason. I'm saying God is pissed at this point. Because he has a time, a lot of people forget, God has a time of remembrance as well. So he's remembering all of these things. He's remembering how they oppressed his people. He's pissed, but he's still contained. He's still showing mercy, because when you read it very carefully, the trumpets, over and over and over. you're going to see a third of, a third of, a third of. This is important because, again, this is my belief. My father told me this a long time ago. So it's, I guess it's our belief. It's almost as if God is saying, okay, like to Satan, God of this world, you took a third of my kingdom, because remember, Lucifer took a third of the stars, meaning Lucifer took a third of the holy angels, now what we call demons. You took a third of my kingdom, I'm taking a third of yours. Tit for tat. So as you read to them, you see over and over and over, God is tapping a third, tapping a third, tapping a third. That's important because it's going to come up again. It's going to come up again with the vials. So when you go into chapter 9, it talks about the locust. I don't know, I've heard a lot of people say some strange stuff, but again, it's their beliefs. I believe these are spirits. I believe they're spirits, been taught they're spirits since I was a boy, and that's what I maintain. Some people say that it's helicopters. Okay. Some people say it's going to be some sort of other technology. We're talking about the locust that comes out of the bottomless pit and smoke of the earth. Now, if you've ever seen a swarm of locusts, if it's a really big, or any sort of insects, if it's a really big swarm, and if you see it from a distance, it does look like a cloud. So that's probably why it's called smoke. Thing is, I don't see how this could be helicopters. There's not like that many helicopters to any particular nation, number one. Also, the person who leads these locusts is an angel. It's a spiritual being. It's not a man. So I don't know how or why a spirit would lead human-made technology. Plus, when you read the descriptions, again, Revelation is full of imagery. It talks about, say, a horse that is decorated for battle. That could be that these things are, by design, made for war. I don't know. It mentions how their hair is like women. Now, keep in mind, this is John writing it. John lived in a time when women grew their hair really long. Paul said a woman's hair is her glory because it's for her covering. It covers her nakedness. He's obviously not talking about women like today's where they have hair to their shoulder. He's talking about women who probably have hair all the way down past their waist because it's a covering. And that could represent the fact that whatever these locusts are, they're ancient. Because if you think of, for example, you may not know much about Rastafarians, but somebody who starts growing dreadlocks, their dreads are going to be, real short. But a Rastafarian who's been a Rasta for a very long time, I've seen some of them where their dreads are, or would have been already dragging on the ground if they didn't tuck them up or cut them. So they've been a Rastafarian longer than these other guys have. So the hair like women could represent the fact that they're ancient. Teeth like lion, I don't know, you can think what that is however you want. But again, whenever you see like a face like a man, that typically represents, as I've been taught since 33 decades ago, that typically tends to represent that whatever it is has a measure of wisdom. It can think, it can react like a man can think and react. But it also says, it has a breastplate of iron. So if it is a small bug type thing, you can forget about raid killing it. You can forget about smashing it with your boot. If it has a breastplate of iron, it typically represents it's indestructible. You cannot destroy a spirit. What are you going to fight a demon with? You're going to fight it with a stick? It's a spirit. It's not going to feel anything. Not from you. Spirits are immortal. Do they bleed? Why would they bleed? They're not flesh and blood. So anyway, as far as what I can tell, and what I've always been able to tell, these are spirits. Then you move on to the other spirits, the ones that were bound at the river. Some people think that these are tanks because it talks about how fire and brimstone comes from the mouth and people are killed from the fire and brimstone. Well, doesn't the same thing apply to the two witnesses later on in Revelation? How anyone that tries to kill them, they spew fire from the mouth. It does not mean they're tanks. None of you have thought that the two witnesses are tanks, but for whatever reason, some people think that these demons are actual tanks shooting fire and brimstone. Either way, I have no plans of being around to actually experience or see any of this anyway, and nor should you. But from what I see, these are spiritual beings, because they're ruled by spiritual beings. I believe that whatever these things are, they're probably not the sort of spirits that we can see. They probably have some sort of form that we can see, which could be why the locusts have been locked away in the abyss, and why these other four creatures have been bound at the Euphrates River. You may have other opinions, and of course, post your comments so we can see them. This isn't me telling you what it is, it's telling you what I see, and hopefully to give you a different way to look at things, or make you consider some things you may not have ever considered before. The point is, I think with this, be careful not to humanize the elements in Revelation. I think it's not even really about the trumpets, even though I said part 3 is going to be about the trumpets. The thing I want to drive home to you is be careful not to humanize elements of Revelation. People try to humanize Jesus, saying he's a black guy because he's got woolly hair and black skin, even though the Bible says nothing about either of that. But that's what cults do. They try to humanize God. Same thing with the locusts and the being helicopters, or these other demons being tanks. You're trying to humanize it. You gotta remember, Jeremiah said this will be the worst time in all of human history. Jesus said the same thing. It will be the worst time. It's never been like this, and it will never be like it again. In fact, unless those days are shortened, all flesh will perish, which you'll probably see once we get to part 5, which is going to deal with the vials. So anyway, that's part 3, a little bit shorter than the rest, which is fine. Again, I was not going to go through every single scripture with you. The main thing I wanted to point out to you is the third, dealing with the trumpets. Sorry, you pre-wrathers are not getting into the rapture is at the last trumpet. And by the way, in fact, let me say something like that. Let me address that. Pre-wrath belief has not existed for more than 25 years. It didn't exist when I was a boy. The main 3 schools of thought is pre-tribulation, which has existed for 2,000 years. You see that, you people talking about John Darby don't. You see that in writings from Irenaeus, Ephraim, and Cyphram. 1st, 2nd, and 3rd centuries. John Darby's great-great-great-grandparents weren't even born. So you see this in their writings. But anyway, pre-wrath, they seem to think that the rapture occurs in the 7th trumpet. Since we're dealing with trumpets, I might as well mention that. Why? Because Paul says that, that day will come at the last trumpet, blah, 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 blah. But what people forget is Paul was a Roman. And the Romans, when you're dealing with trumpets, you're dealing with sounds. So in the Roman military, they're shouting orders. And the last order is basically to pack up and go home. The last trump. You gotta remember, Paul was a Roman. Paul was not talking anything about what John's revelation was about. So anyway, just what I figured I'll just touch on that. My battery's dying. I see the red, so I don't want to keep talking just in case I'm cut off. But next part will be part 4. It'll deal with the 2 witnesses, the woman and the child, war in heaven, and it will address again the 144,000, the bitter book that John ate, and the 7 thunders. And then finally we'll get to part 5, and it will deal with primarily the vials and also the fall of Babylon. All right, we'll see you in part 4.